Okay, thanks, Zach.
Yeah, thanks,
So,
Zach.
while we're here today, Oak Wilt, and of the recent webinars that we've been doing during this coronavirus period, so far this has had the most registrations. So it's obviously a topic that people are interested in. It's something that I've been dealing with through my whole career as an arborist, and we'll talk about kind of the history of oak wilt. That's been a problem in the United States for a long time. So before we jump into that, a little bit about myself. I have been with Arborjet for 6 years. I'm the South Central Technical Manager. I'm based in Dallas, Texas. I cover Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arkansas, Kansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma. I forgot to mention that one. Anyways, 6 states. Before that, I was the plant and healthcare manager at a Dallas area tree care company. And so I've been treating trees. I've been treating trees for about 10 years. I've seen a lot in the field. I became a certified arborist in 2011. And at the end of 2017, I became a board certified master arborist. My education is in agronomy and crop science. And so plant soil science, growing things, plant pathology, chemicals. That's really what I was educated on through school at Texas Tech. But I found out that I love arboriculture. And so what I do now is kind of combine those two passions together. And it's really a fun job, and it's been a great career for me here at Arborjet. You can see in that left photo, that is me with, that's my favorite tree. That's on my family's farm back in South Texas. And that's just kind of your quintessential Texas live oak. And so oak wilt in Texas is different than it is up north. And so that's why it's good to have Joe on here, because we can kind of give both perspectives, and we have a mixed audience that's wanting to learn about this topic. And so the thing with the oaks in Texas, you can just see how massive these live oaks get. And that's, that one there is big, but there's plenty of others that are much larger than that. And so when something like that's on your property, it just adds tremendous value. It's irreplaceable. And so, like I said, that's my favorite tree. And so when you have a pathogen like oak wilt that's threatening those types of trees, it becomes very emotional for the landowners and the homeowners. All right, Joe, you want to take a second to introduce yourself?
Yeah, a lot of you guys know me. Nickname's Arborjet Joe, because when I hired in with Arborjet over 18 years ago, there was like 4 Joes working at the company. So I became Arborjet Joe, which is easier to say. At one time, I had the whole country, and as Arborjet grew, my territory grew, shrank a little bit. Now I have a lot of the Great Lakes states in Canada. Again, been in the industry probably 40 years. Ish. It's hard to believe I took my first tree down at 14, and now that I'm that old. But I love arboriculture. I'm a climber by trade. Still love to climb, but over the last 22 years, I spent a lot of my time in the science side. Practical arborist, got to see it to believe it. It's one of the great things I love about Arborjet is that we're always trying to work harder to find the solutions for you and test everything that's out there to make sure that what you guys get is the best that we can give you. Involved a lot with ISA. I'm the president of the Arboriculture Society of Michigan Foundation. Some of you guys may have seen at an ISA event the history of arboriculture display. That's me. We started a museum, and there will be a public museum for arboriculture real soon. So great background in arboriculture. I love what I do, and I love helping you guys out. So that's about all I got for today.
So let's talk a little bit first about the history of oak wilt. Like I said, it's been around for quite some time. It was first reported oak mortality in the 1890s. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a problem here. Here we go. 1890s oak mortality. You know, back then our science, especially plant care science, was not nearly as sophisticated as it was today or is today. So people saw the trees dying, but they really didn't know what to associate it with. And so it just started being called oak decline. And in Texas, that was going on as early as the 1930s. People were just reporting this oak decline. Finally, in Wisconsin, they detected it as the oak wilt pathogen, as in the 1940s. And then in Dallas, Texas, a positive identification, 1961. The origin of this pathogen is really undetermined. It just kind of showed up. Nobody really knows where it came from, but it's thought to be an introduced species. One of the reasons they had such a hard time figuring out what the pathogen was is because it's very sensitive to heat. And so when they would take these cultures from the trees, they were not keeping them refrigerated. And so what happened is the pathogen they wouldn't be able to generate it in a petri dish or anything like that, because the heat ended up killing it before they could get it to the lab. And so finally they started refrigerating the samples, and that's when they were able to culture Ceratocystis fagacearum, which has now been changed to another name. And so basically, once they figured out what it was, they started looking for treatments for it. And at that time, there was a lot of Dutch elm disease treatments going on. Both of these pathogens are vascular wilts. And so they basically borrowed the research from Dutch elm disease and were applying it to oak wilt, thinking that, hey, they're injecting these elms with the fungicide Arborjet, which is thiabendazole. They thought maybe we can just do the same thing on these oaks and have the same kind of success. Unfortunately, that did not happen. Arborjet is not nearly as effective against oak wilt as it is against Dutch elm disease. Hey, Zach, can you mute Joe until he's getting on?
Oh,
there we go. So they were trying with thiabendazole. That didn't really work out. And so then the Texas Oak Wilt Suppression Project was initiated in 1988. And a lot of that project at the time was to do cost share on trenching. You know, in Texas, we have a lot of large properties, and that's really where the threat of this pathogen is to these huge ranches and expanses of rural area. It's kind of following the native range of the Texas live oak. And so trenching is an effective way to slow the spread of oak wilt because it is spread through underground root grafts. And so they would put these trenches in, and that was slowing it down while they were developing the Alamo fungicide. And what a better name for a fungicide developed in Texas, right? And so Alamo was developed in 1990, and that's 14.3% propiconazole. So propiconazole is much more effective at inhibiting the spread of the pathogen than is thiabendazole. So oak wilt, which is, you know, I'm not even going to attempt the new scientific name, Bretzula fagacearum, which is, you know, what it's always been called is Ceratocystis fagacearum, and that's what most people continue to call it. It is a vascular wilt disease. Red oak and live oak is going to be your most susceptible species. White oak species are tolerant to oak wilt. And I say tolerant, and it's underlined because there's a difference between tolerance and resistance. The word resistance indicates that the plants won't get it. They're resistant to getting that pathogen. When tolerant is a more acceptable term because they will get it, they just tolerate it better. They die more slowly, essentially. Red oaks, on the other hand, it runs through them very quickly. They can die within weeks of getting symptoms. Live oaks will endure an infection for a couple to 3 years. And it has to do with the tree's ability to compartmentalize. And so live oaks are very good at compartmentalization. And so they are able to block off and slow the spread of that pathogen through their vascular system. Whereas red oaks are less able to do that. And it basically runs rampant through their vascular system. And so by the time the tree is trying to compartmentalize the infected tissues, it's too late. And so what I mean by a vascular wilt disease is that it's a pathogen that affects the tree's vascular system. It's basically inhibiting the water movement inside the tree. And so you can see in the photos there, especially on the red oak, that looks a lot like drought stress or scorch. And that's basically what's happening. As the tree is attempting to inhibit the spread of fungus, it's walling off, it's closing off its vascular tissue, and so the tree is not able to conduct water like it needs to. And so you see these drought-type symptoms. In Texas, we get that beautiful symptom on the top. It's called venal necrosis. And that's the telltale, that's the textbook symptom. But I'm going to show you some other symptoms of it as we go through this. So in Texas, oak wilt is primarily spread through underground root grafts. It can be spread above ground by the nidotulid beetle, which is a fungus farmer. So this is only happening in the springtime when there's fungal mats for these nidotulid beetles to roll around in and get to. Because of that above ground spread, there is a statement that you do not prune oak trees between February and June, because that is the time of the year that the nidotulid is most active. And if you must prune your trees, you're supposed to paint the wounds. And in areas where there's a lot of oak wilt pressure, tree care companies have gone to painting wounds year round. Only the red oaks produce fungal mats. So in Texas, these fungal mats are rare, and most people haven't seen them. I've never seen a fungal mat on a red oak. Up north, that's all they have is red oaks. They don't have these live oaks up there, and so the fungal mats are much more prevalent. You can treat, and I underscored prevent, oak wilt. The preventative applications work very, very good, whereas the therapeutic treatments are not nearly as effective. Before I go any further, I know there's a lot of people from Texas on here, and oak wilt is kind of a sensitive subject in Texas, and it's been something I've had to tiptoe around and navigate pretty carefully. And I just want to put this for full disclosure out there that the views that I'm going to show in here and share with you today are not the views of Texas A&M. I'm not affiliated with Texas A&M. I'm not affiliated with the Texas Forest Service. The things that I'm talking about are through my experience of treating trees, and also through my network of applicators that I work with and things that I've seen in the field over the years. This slide is from Texas A&M. So this is just talking about how oak wilt is spread. So there is the above ground sap beetle, the nidotulid. And so basically a red oak that has died from oak wilt at the end, say a red oak died at the end of 2019 from oak wilt. If there's still enough moisture content in that tree going into the spring of 2020, it is capable of producing a fungal mat, and that's underneath the bark. And so that bark will basically rupture. There's a fungal mat over there. Apparently they smell like juicy fruit gum, and it attracts these beetles to the fungus. They roll around in the spores, and then they will smell a fresh wound on an oak. And the wound can come from pruning. It could come from a hailstorm. It could come from a woodpecker. It could come from a squirrel chewing on the tree, whatever. And it's going to move. You know, basically the idea is that nidotulid beetle is going to fly over to the fresh cut and inoculate the other tree with oak wilt. Here's the venal necrosis. So this is the symptom that's textbook. This is what you're looking for underneath live oaks when you suspect they have oak wilt. When you find them, you know, it's very unlikely that it's any other disease or other abiotic condition that's causing these types of symptoms. And it's really a cool symptom when you do find it for the first time. It's kind of exciting. But yeah, so it's kind of a telltale thing for live oaks. But that said, they don't always show that symptom. Sometimes it can look a little bit different. So on the left-hand side, this is in an active oak wilt center. I took that photo, and that almost looks like herbicide damage with the chlorosis. But you can see towards the bottom of that picture that there's a, some tip dieback on one of those leaves. In the middle photo, that is really kind of a nondescript symptom. But that, again, that's in an active oak wilt center. And on the right-hand side, there is some veinal necrosis, but there's a lot of marginal necrosis on that live oak. And so these symptoms can kind of exhibit themselves in different ways. That's not always going to be that textbook veinal necrosis. And so that's where having experience with this pathogen comes into play. Once you find it and work with it, it becomes very easy to diagnose just in the field. The Texas A&M Diagnostic Lab does recommend sending in samples to get confirmed, but from my experience, I don't think the tree owners really have that luxury to wait for the sample to go through. At their lab, especially in the summertime, they get really backed up, and that's great because it means people are utilizing that resource. But it's also a downside to the tree owner because they're having to wait for weeks to get that confirmed diagnosis. And so as you gain experience with oak wilt, a lot of people are really confident in just seeing the visual symptoms, looking around for other infected species, and just go ahead and calling it right there. Hey, this is probably oak wilt. Let's go ahead and start treating the trees that we can save. So in Texas, the spread of oak wilt, really goes all the way from the coast near Corpus Christi, and it kind of follows the I-35 corridor if you're familiar with Texas. So it's going to go from Corpus Christi up to San Antonio, to Austin, all the way up to Fort Worth. And so that's really the range of the Texas live oak. And then you can see there's some isolated counties out in West Texas, Amarillo, Lubbock, Midland. There's oak wilt out in those counties. And so it was moved out there most likely through the spread of firewood. But in kind of that core area of connected counties, that's most likely having to do with root grafting. And these massive live oaks like the one I showed earlier, their roots can extend really, really far. It's unbelievable. A lot of people think roots just go to the drip line, but they go much, much further. When you have these oaks that are several hundred years old, they've been growing roots that entire time, and so their roots can extend really far across the landscape. So your management strategy with oak wilt is, number one, to find the disease center. When I first started with Arborjet, I went out to Utopia, Texas. This is in the fall of 2014. And Utopia is really in the middle of nowhere, Texas. It took me a while to get there from Dallas. And I was helping this large property. It was a huge, I think it was the 20,000 acre ranch out there. And they thought they had oak wilt. And the guy had found our Arborjet website, liked what he saw, contacted me. And so I met kind of the applicator that worked for the ranch. And he was like, I think we have it, but how do I know? Where do I find it? I said, well, take me to the dead trees. He's like, okay, I know where that is. And so you can see in this photo, this is in Dallas. That tree in the foreground is showing symptoms. The tree behind it is dead. And so if you can locate that disease center, find the dead trees, with oak wilt, there's usually going to be a pattern. There's going to be some dead trees in the center, and then moving outward from there, you're going to find symptomatic trees. And so if you find dead and dying trees, your management strategy is those need to be removed as soon as possible, especially if they're red oaks, because those are just going to serve as a source of inoculum for the neighboring trees, especially if they're left over the course of the winter and into the springtime when they can produce fungal mats. And so remove the trees that are infected. Live oaks can tolerate the disease better. And so I'd say you want to remove the ones that have 30% or greater crown thinning. You can treat the symptomatic live oaks with fungicide. It's a really high rate, 20 milliliters per inch. But then you want to find the trees that are adjacent, within 150 feet of a diseased tree, And that's going to be your kind of your treatment radius. Anything within 150 feet of a diseased tree is going to get injected, treated with fungicide if they want to save it. You can install a trench if possible. Those can be really challenging. Our soils in Texas vary greatly. We have some very deep soils, and then in other areas of the state, there are very rocky soils. When your soils are deep, oak wilt becomes nearly impossible to control. My hometown of Hondo, Texas, there's a neighborhood called Coleman Oaks, and it's near a creek. The soils are very deep there, and the oaks are huge, or I should say they were huge. Oak wilt got into that neighborhood, and there's not many oak trees left in that. And when I say they're huge, I mean, we're talking oak trees that are 70 inches in diameter. Just gorgeous yards, gorgeous homes there. And this pathogen got into there. There's no way you could do trenching because the soils are too deep, and there's roots connected from these huge trees all over the place. And so it is a very difficult pathogen to manage. You know, this is a strategy, but I should put another bullet point on here that you have to set expectations with the tree owners or with the landowners that, hey, this is the best we have to offer is these treatments. It's not a guarantee. The fungicide lasts in the trees for about 2 years. And then after that, it needs to be done again, especially if they're in a high pressure area. And so set those expectations, get ready for the trees to die. Go ahead and start planting some non-oak species. Some folks will say, well, you could plant a bur oak or some other type of white oak. Just get away from the oaks. If you're in an active oak wilt area, put a cedar elm in there, put any other number of native species back in, but get away from the oaks. For a long time, macro infusion has been the standard treatment procedure for oak wilt treatments. And this goes back to what I was talking about with borrowing the information from Dutch elm disease. Dutch elm disease is treated this way because the fungicide, thiabendazole, is very damaging to the trees. It'll kill the trees if it's not diluted with enough water. And so this is the way they were injecting trees back then. And so it's really just got applied to oak wilt because that was the technology that they had. And if you're doing it right, you're going to expose the root collar, probably even further than these photos that I'm showing here. Macro infusion uses 1 liter of water per diameter inch of tree. And you mix up your fungicide. So a lot of the guys that do a lot of oak wilt in Texas have basically repurposed these beer kegs. They slap a sticker on them. They chain them to the trees and leave them there until that's done, because it is a very slow process. It's a high volume. And not only that, but you're working on trees that have a inhibited vascular system. So they're much slower to take the materials. And so when you get on some of the large trees that I've mentioned, you got multiple kegs attached to the trees. And so it is effective. It's worked for a long time as an effective treatment for oak wilt. There's people that do a lot of this every single day. It is very labor intensive, especially if you're doing it the right way. And you can see in this photo how far out they've come on the root flare and just how many injection sites they have all over that tree. So whoever did this job knew exactly what they were doing. They're very experienced with macro infusion. It just can be a very time-consuming process.
Hey, Emmett, one question that kind of fits in where you are right now was about, should you be treating perimeter trees before removing dead and dying trees?
That's a good question. Ideally, you would do both. You need to get the dead tree out of there. In a perfect world, I would say rogue the trees first. Anything that has symptoms, get it out of there. Get that infection out of the property. However, people are so attached to their trees. They want you to treat. They'll have trees that are 50% canopy loss, and they'll want you to treat them. And it just becomes very difficult to turn those trees around. And even the trees that survive, if they're infected with this disease and you treat them and they survive, they look terrible. They'll look terrible for years. And so you have to begin doing things to restore their vigor through treating the soils with fertilizers and carbon sources and things like that.
Joe, do you have anything
You're going to
add?
have to do, to answer that question, you're going to have to do both. If it's a red oak, you definitely want to get it out as soon as possible.
Hey, Emmett, here in Michigan, the unfortunate thing is that there's some debate about the covalent bond between the grafting roots, that if you take an infected tree, there's a slingshot of that fungal pathogen from a diseased tree to a new tree. So it's not as quick as we think, but we're asking that if you're going to do the tree removal before the other trees are treated, you either have to have that stump ground out right away or paint the top of it. There's even some trials on burning the top of the stump of the removed tree just to eliminate that potential of the bonding of molecules from one tree to the other through root graft to reach the other tree.
So in Michigan, they're recommending to inject the adjacent trees and then do your removals.
That way, if something happens, you bump into the canopy, anything happens, that tree is protected during that removal.
Hey, Daddy, after you're done with the phone,
So with Arborjet, you know, when I started 6 years ago, we had the tree IV, as you can see here. This actually works really good for oak wilt. It's a really simple device, easy to use. And so with this device, we're able to apply the same dosage of fungicide. We just use a much lower volume of water. You don't always have to expose the root flares. And so a lot of people have been attracted to this because it's just so much easier, less labor intense. It's still a slow application. You know, don't get me wrong. If you're treating oak wilt, it's slow. I do not like to treat trees for oak wilt because of that reason. But I think this is just as an effective measure to treat trees. One of the things I should go back and mention on these root flares, the idea behind getting low down on the flares like that is because the pathogen infiltrates through root grafting, you want that fungicide as low down on the tree as possible. The way that propiconazole works is it inhibits the fungus from growing and spreading in the tree. It doesn't kill the fungus, it just inhibits the growth. And so the idea is if you put this fungicide low down on the root flares, it's going to keep that fungus from getting up into the trunk of the tree better. The problem with this is that the more dilution, and this is something we've known at Arborjet for a long time, is the more diluted your material is, the faster it's going to move up into the canopy. And the less dilute that your material is, it's going to stay in the wood of the tree longer. And so when you're diluting with this, it actually moves that fungicide away from these injection sites faster. So back on the tree IV, each unit has 4 valves on it. So basically you can do about 10 diameter inches from one unit. You load up the proper dose into that bottle, pressurize it up with the bike pump, and set it up on the tree. And if we have time, we're already half an hour into this. If we have time, we'll talk about the application procedure. But a few different setups for the tree IV. What you see there is a tree IV 2-pack, comes with 2 units. You're not going to be able to get much production out of that setup. Basically you could do one 20-inch tree with that, or 2 10-inch trees. And so on these big ones, you need a lot of bottles, basically. You can kind of leapfrog with this system. You set one unit up, and then you start working, loading up the second bottle. In good situations, if you're doing preventative applications, by the time you load up the second bottle, the first one's already drained. And so you can just keep kind of working and get into a rhythm and leapfrog across the property. And that's what I was doing here. Earlier, I showed a picture of a symptomatic red oak. This is actually the neighboring property, and I was on site helping this applicator. You can see just in this photo, we've got like 5 tree IVs visible. I think we were working with 8 that day, treating with propofol. And I just thought it was a great picture with the American flag in the background and everything. So on red oaks, you can do the preventative applications pretty quickly. More recently, we've introduced the F series, which is like the new and improved tree IV. And what I wanted to highlight in this picture is the larger size reservoirs that we have. So those bottles have a capacity of 1 liter. And so we can do, more diameter inches and put more product into each bottle. And so in the Oak Wilt community in Texas, this has been very well received, this piece of equipment. Guys down in Central Texas really like using it, helping them get more trees done faster. So some of the improvements we made on the to the F series, what I really like is on that right-hand photo, you can see the black cap. That's a fill port. And so we're able to fill up the unit with fungicide solution without having to take the unit completely apart. And so that makes it much more efficient. That's the slowest part of using these pump up systems, is having to refill them for each tree that you're doing. And then we also introduced a 6-way splitter. So instead of 4 lines per unit, we have 6. So basically we're able to get more diameter inches done from 1 unit. Some of the research done, this was a study, some data from a study that was done in association with the Texas ISA. Essentially, trees were injected with various different injection systems. There's a bunch of tree injection companies out there. There's Arborjet, ChemJets, Moget capsules, Tree Tech capsules. There's a device called the Pine Infuser, the Wedgel, and then macro infusion. So there's all these different ways to inject trees. And so people have been asking, well, what's the best way? Are these other ones just as effective as macro infusion? And so this study was initiated in 2011, which was just a terrible, terrible drought in Texas. And so, they were wanting to redo the study due to those facts, but it didn't get anywhere to redo it. But the data from that study is showing that there's no significant difference between using the tree IV and using the macro infusion method. I've been in contact with Dave Apple. He's the Texas A&M researcher that does most of the Oak Wilt stuff in Texas. He's who was responsible for developing Alamo fungicide all those years ago. He apparently did a study just comparing the Arborjet tree IV to macro infusion. And from my conversations with him, he says it's looking good. I reached out, was unable to get the data from him just yet. He's not ready yet, not published yet, but that's what he shared with me. The other thing is propofol. So if you read things about treating for oak wilt, you're going to find Alamo fungicide. And then in parentheses, it says 14.3% propiconazole. Propofol is made by Syngenta, and Alamo is made by Syngenta. The thing with propofol is it has the broadest label of any propiconazole product on the market. Not only is it labeled for oak wilt, it's labeled for like 45 other diseases, including the Pelodia tip blight on pines. And so just gives you a lot more flexibility with what you can do with it. Propiconazole is a broad spectrum fungicide. It's effective on a wide variety of pathogens, both leaf diseases and vascular wilts. And so with propofol, you're able to use it through macro infusion if that's the method you want to use. You can use it through, it's labeled to be used through the Arborjet equipment. You can use it diluted or undiluted. So it's just much more flexible to what you can do with this product. In some research that was done in Minnesota, this is done with Jennifer Juswick with University of Minnesota, basically comparing the propofol through Arborjet system to Alamo and the macro system. And what they found is that if you treat the trees with propiconazole, they lived. And if you did not treat the trees, they died. And so the way most oak wilt research is done is they inject the trees with fungicide, and then they come back below the injection sites and inoculate the trees with a solution of oak wilt. And so it's a really high pressure situation. And so as you can see in this graph, the trees that weren't treated, they died. The pathogen was able to get in the tree and kill it. I'm more interested in doing some research where it's kind of a field situation, you know, a naturally challenged situation where you treat trees that are neighboring an infection site or a disease center, and just let oak wilt challenge them naturally, because that's what you're going to run into more so than inoculating the trees with oak wilt. As I was preparing this presentation, I came across a research paper. It's titled "The Propiconazole Distribution and Effects on Ceratocystis Fagacearum, Survival and Roots of Treated Red Oaks." So basically, it's measuring the amount of pathogen that lives in the root system after the trees have been treated with propiconazole. I took an excerpt. This was in the discussion. This is like the last couple of sentences out of the paper. The several propiconazole formulations are available, and application methods vary considerably. Choice of formulation and application method based on maximum movement into and longevity in the root system may result in greater treatment efficacy for oak wilt, whereas options which achieve the greatest and most uniform distribution in the crown could be more appropriate for the management of laurel wilt and Dutch elm disease, where the insect vector plays a much more prevalent role in pathogen transmission. It's a really long couple of sentences. What that's saying is if you can inject the trees in a way where the fungicide stays on the lower portion of the tree, you will probably have better results than if you inject it in a method that gets the propiconazole distributed throughout the canopy. And so that's what we've known at Arborjet for a long time, is that if you apply with a more concentrated solution, it moves more slowly and it's going to stay in the trunk of the tree. Where if you dilute with lots of water, like macroinfusion does, you're going to get much better distribution in the canopy. And so as they borrowed that research from Dutch elm disease all those years ago, you know, Dutch elm disease is spread by bark beetles. And so you need that good distribution up in the canopy. The two pathogens are different. In Texas, we're dealing with root grafting. And up there, they're dealing with vector transmission. Okay, I think I've used up most of the time, Joe, but I'm gonna let you take it on from here. Oh, and you're still on mute. Hang on a second. There we go.
Not anymore, buddy. Yeah, I think Emmett touched on a lot of great things. Nice job, Emmett. Yeah, get a drink of water.
Yeah.
You know, the biggest thing is that, you know, Emmett touched on sampling. I know up in the Midwest, we got a lot of great university extensions. And you can go by signs or symptoms. Like there's a lot of things listed on the slide that could be very similar in a sign of that tree. If it's an important enough site, I still recommend taking a sample and sending it in. You know, Emmett's right. It may take a week or two to get it back. It doesn't mean that you can't treat that day or you can't get the tree treated. But you know, it's a confirmation that that's in the site. There's a couple of great things that you can look for. Like I said, you're talking about all these other things, signs and symptoms that look alike. But until you can confirm it, you have a hard time with your treatment program. Also in the Midwest, what we've done, you can switch slides. What we've done up here in Michigan is the Michigan DNR has created a forest health website. So there's a lot of things to help you identify what's wrong with the tree, is it oak wilt or not, and where is oak wilt specifically. So if you're not 100% sure the difference between a red oak and a white oak, It is the tips of the leaves and the rounding in the margins. So if you look at the red oak leaf, you can see the pointy tips on the lobes. And if you look at the white oak, they're rounded. Really easy to tell. Then if you get into cultivars within red and white, that could be a little bit different. The red oak leaf looks a heck of a lot different than the a live oak, that's for sure. So getting better at your tree ID is going to be huge to make sure that you're actually looking at the right tree. So up in Michigan, the funny thing is that I know they say that white oaks are susceptible, and we still have to look. I have not seen or had any confirm in the Midwest where a white oak has got it yet. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't still be looking at it.
So what I've seen on white oaks, Joe, is when the pressure is really high, they will get it. So on that property I mentioned out in Utopia, Texas, it was primarily live oaks in that area. But in the disease center, at Oak Wilt Center, there was a post oak, which is a species of white oak that had gotten oak wilt. All the live oaks around it were completely stone cold dead. And then this one was showing symptoms, just like what you're seeing in this photo here. So the pressure has to be really high, but they will get it.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Emmett. Again, they've been fighting it a lot longer, even though that it's been in Michigan probably since the 40s, late 40s. I know it was discovered in Wisconsin in the 40s. It's kind of been a small, like a small little smoldering up in northern Michigan. If you take the mitten of Michigan, you can kind of see there's a straight line. I can't right now. I got asked to help by my son, but so if you kind of look at the northern half of northern or lower Michigan, you can kind of see there's a line of counties, and then there's a few counties in between where it didn't have it. That's primarily a red oak area in Michigan, and that's kind of where it's been. And it's so desolate up there that it's been kind of popping around on its own, being spread by windstorms and human interjection. A lot of people have, we call it, we're going to go up north, and everybody's got their cottages up there, so they're doing a lot of cleaning up in the springtime, cutting down trees, pruning branches off, not knowing that there is a pretty serious disease in Michigan. So over the last couple of years, it's really ramped up here and spreading pretty quickly to the point where in Michigan we started an Oak Wilt Coalition, and it's a combination of the Michigan DNR, MSU, Michigan State University, Michigan's ISA chapter, and all the major energy groups, anybody that has to do with tree trimming, so it can kind of help control this. Again, the MDNR, Scott Lint, who's the forest health specialist for Michigan, he was trying to get on, but he took this afternoon off, but I was going to try to get some information from him to help out. But they tried this really live GIS-based forest health app where you can go on your phone and identify where it's been confirmed, where samples have been set in, and send your samples in to have the DNR come out to either confirm or deny what it is. So we're trying very hard. Hey, Patrick. We're trying very hard to let the people in the Michigan and the Midwest know exactly where this is, because that's going to determine your treatment plan. So a lot of good things going on. Next. In Michigan, Midwest, red oaks. This is a great telltale sign. Again, there's a lot of other pathogens on red oaks, but end of July, August, if you have a tree that you're showing some symptoms and you're just not sure, and you haven't got a chance to get a tissue sample into for inspection, this is a good one. You're all sitting out there and all the leaves defoliate. That is oak wilt. So that would make me nervous. I would make sure, even if it's on a neighbor's yard, that's going to let you know that there's something serious going on. Next.
Wanted to add something. So because it's a vascular wilt disease, the symptoms do look a lot like drought. And so under severe drought conditions, this is what you're going to see. Generally with red oaks, this is going to happen earlier. So even before, like in Texas, I can pretty much guarantee you it's going to be hot and dry in July, and you're going to see drought symptoms on red oaks at that time. But you're going to see symptoms like this happening much earlier in the year before you'd expect to see symptoms associated with drought stress. So something like this on red oaks may be happening like at the end of April or in May, before we're in that hot and dry period.
Emmett, before you continue on, there was a good question that ties pretty well into the last few sides of what tissues should you sample for confirmation?
That's good. MSU recommends about 1 inch diameter. They can't be totally dead, but they got to be the branches that are flagging. So again, if you don't have a way to access the canopy, get someone to access it for you. I've seen people use the inline saw that you could use on a throw line to get a couple branches down, but around a 1/2 inch to a 1/2 inch, about 1 foot long, is what they're going to need to pull culture out of that to throw it on the Petri dish and get a confirmation.
You should be able
another good thing, like
on the
another thing, like Emmett said, make sure that you're careful that you might want to pack that in a couple of those breaking ice packs or cool packs, because it is sensitive to heat, and if it takes a while to get there, it could skew your test.
Yeah, and for the guys from Texas, guys and gals from Texas, the Texas A&M Diagnostic Lab, they have a full website devoted to how to do a proper sample from a tree. If you're going to take the time to do it, make sure you do it right. So check out the Diagnostic Lab's website, and all those instructions will be there.
On the sampling, have you used any of the DNA testing services?
Joe, that's a good question. I have gotten feedback from some applicators on the DNA testing that they do not feel it is as accurate. It could be how they are sampling and sending it in. I am not sure. You know, I'd have to get comfortable with it myself in order to start recommending that. I do know that they can turn and get you results a lot faster than your diagnostic labs that are actually going to try to culture the pathogen. But I'm not sure it's going to be as accurate.
Well, in theory, it can't die in transport. It doesn't matter if it dies in transport.
Right.
What would be the advantage that I see there? You don't need to pack it nice. You can send it 2 weeks later, in theory.
Right. So I would have to get comfortable with it first. You know, I'd have to send in some samples of trees that I know have oak wilt and see how they're doing before I would trust them. That's just my point of view.
It's a great question, or a great, in theory, you know, finding it faster and confirming it faster is obviously a huge benefit to a treatment program. This slide, pressure pads, like I said, Emmett says they don't see this in Texas, but man, it's in the Midwest. With the first time about 4 or 5 years ago, I was working with the Michigan DNR, and one of the forest specialists is like, man, go up there and check it out. So they started teasing me, telling me that, oh yeah, put your nose in there and smell it. It smells like juicy fruit chewing gum. Now I thought they were setting me up for a joke on Joe, but believe it or not, that is probably some of the sweetest smelling fungal mats you're ever going to have. So that is a telltale time that there's a fungal mat, there's a spore mat there. If you scratch at it and when they're thriving, man, does it smell good. So the picture on the left is where you can start to tell where, and this is even before the canopy's flagging, that there's something going on there. You take you can pull some of that bark back and take a whiff in there. If it's a sweet smelling a fungal mat back there, it's probably pretty sure it's oak wilt. Next. All right, just anybody in the Midwest, you can check with your local state extension. There's some really good ones all around the country. So I use Michigan State, obviously, because I'm a Michigan State guy. But this is their lab. They're great. They're good turnaround. So you can take this information down. Or again, if it's a suspect tree, get it into testing as soon as you can. Next. All right. We talked a little bit about the Oak Wilt Coalition and what we're doing here. Again, it comes all down to public education. I think it's amazing that there's 130 attendees today on the seminar. We're all pretty versed in it, and we're hoping that we can share some additional information that maybe you didn't know or refresh you on. Public education is probably the most important. We're applying for grants right now to do public education in the Midwest on what and what not to do. There was a great question in the chat about pruning and when to prune. In the Midwest, we're saying, I think right now, because it's 50, 60 degrees, we're just now going to get into weather where we're going to have 50-degree days for the next couple of weeks. I think we're done pruning. I would not prune an oak tree on someone's property unless it was essential and it was a hazard or something was broke off. And we're putting everything on hold other than treatments this summer to treatments after your first frost, which puts you out into November, December, January in the off season. So that was a great question, and that's our recommendation here in the Midwest. The picture is Dr. Don Grossman. He's our entomologist. He does a great job helping out throughout there. His background was with the Texas Forest Service, so we have him on staff. If you ever have any other questions, we can always reach out to Dr. Don too. Next.
Okay, so the next set of slides, which we're approaching the 1 hour mark here. So next set of slides was about the Arborjet application procedure. I did a full webinar on this last Friday, and so what I want to do is just kind of do the Cliff Notes version real quick. Everything we're going to be doing is based off the diameter of the tree, the DBH. Use the diameter tape to find this. Don't do more math than you have to. The diameter tape does the math for you. So I'm going to go through an example here. If your tree diameter is a 20-inch, your rate of fungicide, if you're using the therapeutic rate, is 20 milliliters per inch. So on a 20-inch tree, you'll use 400 milliliters of proposal. I do like to dilute, mainly because proposal is very thick. It's the thickest formulation that we have. I like to dilute it with 2 parts water. And so on that tree, we'd have a 400 milliliters of fungicide, 800 milliliters of water. Your number of injection sites is the diameter divided by 2. So on a 20-inch tree, 10 injection sites is kind of your baseline. On your
Hey, Emmett?
Yes.
Hey, there was a question that came up earlier, and you got on here, quick check air, not recommended for oak wilt.
Right.
There was a question in the chat box about using the quick jet air. As of now, it's not a recommended thing, but I am researching it with the Michigan DNR on oak wilt positive sites. It's been 4 years in the running so far. We're not ready to recommend using it with a straight compound, but we're close.
So I would say if you're doing red oak treatments, that's where its close recommendation is coming from. Live oaks are much slower uptake just in general. And so that's where the pump up, the IV or the F series, that's what those are really, really good at, is the slow uptake situations, which with oak wilt, you're doing live oaks that are slow uptake. They may have a disease that makes them even slower uptake. And then you're pumping in our slowest chemical, and it's diluted to a higher volume. And so you've got anything that can make the application slow That's what's happening right now when you're trying to treat oak wilt. And so for me, I wouldn't, in Texas, I would not do the quick jet air. This is basically the only thing that I would not use the quick jet air for, quite honestly. Onto our equipment, I showed the tree IV earlier. If I was doing a 20-inch diameter tree, I would probably use 8 injection sites, which is 2 tree IV units. It actually works out really well. You can put 600 milliliters of solution into each bottle, and then you have 8 injection sites to get that tree done. If I was using the F series, again, I would split my dosage into 2 bottles, but I would bump up my injection sites. I'd probably do 12 injection sites because I want to utilize all the lines that I have available to me to make sure I get the job done as quick as possible and with the most distribution as possible. You want to target the root flares. Make sure you use sharp drill bits. That's going to improve your uptake speed. When I'm treating for oak wilt, I do want to use an arbor plug, and I'm going to choose to use the large size arbor plug. Because it's a slow uptake situation, I want to use the larger size drill hole to improve speed of uptake. The arbor plug, you know what, Joe, why don't you talk to him about the arbor plug? We had a conversation about this, and since you've been with Arborjet for so long, give your kind of some background on this.
You know, one of the what's interesting about the arbor plug, and it's become you know, a controversy. We talk about the industry. The reason the arbor plug was ever developed was because we had to get higher volumes in the tree, and we were concerned that when we took the system off the tree, the product leaked back out of the tree. So really, how did you know that 100% of your product came in? So we're trying to create a one-way septum into the tree. They started off, you know, if you're down south, they used to use rifle cartridges with silicone plugs and palms. So we tried to come up with a check valve into the vascular system of the tree. And we found that by developing this in areas in the tree, there's a lot of other benefits of this other than just holding the product in the tree. Some of our applications other than oak wilt may take, be administered during times when there's not a lot of transpiration or pull to move the product quickly, so you can get the concentrated product in the tree, pull the system off, and it would move when the tree was transpiring. It does help with compartmentalization, and there's a great research study through Michigan State University that shows with the plug, the wound response behind the plug is amazing, and that those cells are still conductive. So there's a lot of great pros to it. Obviously, a lot more pros than cons. The only con I've ever heard is that people are saying, "Oh my God, geez, you got to pay for a plug." Well, if you pay for a plug or you don't, and if you don't, and the product rolls back out of the tree, how much product did you lose out of that? So it depends on what you're injecting for, what time of the year when not to use a plug.
And the main point I want to drive home with these is just get them set properly. You can see in this photo a bit of a white halo. The white is the xylem tissue. The line where it changes from brown to white is the cambium. And so if you get the outside edge of that plug set below the cambium, the tree will be able to compartmentalize over it very quickly. And it's also sealing that site off from any decay organisms from entering into the tree. All right, we're gonna fast forward through all this. So we've got a lot of people on here from all over the country. Here's the map of the different regional technical managers. Reach out to us. If you don't know your rep, get to know them. We're all stuck at home right now, so no better time to give us a call and have a conversation. Jay Goffner is new with us. He's filling the shoes of Jeff Palmer, who was in the upper Midwest for quite some time. Some big shoes to fill up there. Jay is a great guy. He'd love to hear from you. Just have some really good arborists and some good tree guys. Kevin Brewer up in the Northeast. He recently got his board certified master arborist certification. Kevin Lewis has been with us for just a few years. Great guy. So feel free to reach out if you have questions about this stuff. Get a hold of your rep. If you can't get a hold of them, try me. There's my contact information. Everybody knows Joe, so you can get our information off the website. There's a link for contacting RTM. We're happy to help. We can go ahead and do some questions right now. And the last thing is make sure you either chat your ISA number through the chat or send me an email. Put my email address up there again. That way we're going to do a post-approval CEU for this. It'll take a few weeks for the ISA to approve it, but it should get approved and get you 1 CEU credit for this webinar. Let's go ahead and do some questions. Zach, did you get some?
Yes, we did. Great presentation, guys. Good tag teaming. So we'll start at the earliest questions getting put in and work our way down. All right. Where'd the first one go? There it is. So back to about pruning and about the time frame of pruning. Joe, especially up in Michigan, when would you stop pruning your trees?
Yeah, we kind of touched on that a little bit. Again, and there was even some questions in there about utility pruning.
Mm-hmm.
I'm April to July is a no-touch tree time up here in the Midwest. That is when, because the picnic beetle overwinters as adults. So when you start getting these warm days, the fungus starts to germinate, the spores are sporulating, and then it could spread. So I'm going to say April to July is the highest effective period, and then it starts to taper down. If you can wait till winter. Wait till November, December, January to prune oaks.
Great. All right. And the next question I got, as oaks are a relative of the beech tree, any crossover to members of the same genus? Is there any chance that a beech tree would get oak wilt or some version of it?
They're actually having a hard time on their own with their own little beech leaf disease, beech bark disease. Oh my God. But there's nothing that I've heard of anything or even anybody looking at that. But, you know, we look back at emerald ash borer. We never thought emerald ash borer would switch over to something, and then it found the white fringe tree. So I guess anything's possible.
Okay.
But I haven't heard of anything.
Good for the beech trees. They have their own problems.
Oh yeah.
Somewhat related to stuff that we do in the South, can pruning tools transfer the disease between trees?
Is it transferring on tools?
Yes.
It is my understanding that it will not transfer on tools because of the friction that develops on the tools.
Okay.
The heat from a pruning saw or a chainsaw is too great. It's going to kill that pathogen. And also, unless you cut through a fungal mat, you're not getting actual spores onto your equipment. However, if it makes you feel better or the customer is always right, use Lysol, if you can find any nowadays, or some alcohol spray to spray on the equipment. Do not use bleach. That will ruin your pruning equipment. But, you know, one thing that might be good if you're drilling trees, carry a bottle of rubbing alcohol with you to dunk your drill bit into between trees. That's good to sanitize in between trees.
Awesome. Thanks, Emmett. Any other reasons why you wouldn't use the quick jet air for treating oak wilt? I mean, first thing that comes to my mind is the volume of material you're trying to put into the tree.
That's the main reason.
Give it time. We're working on it though.
All right. Do either of you have any experience trying to convince utilities to prune in less pressure times of the year?
Yes. Like I said, with the coalition up here in Michigan, it's all it is putting a burden on. Just to give you guys an idea. I feel bad for utilities because they got a job to do. They're bidding out grids. They got grids. They're doing a better job in pruning in general. A lot of the utility contractors I work for are just amazing arborists now. They're trying to do the best they can, and then everybody doesn't want them touching the trees, especially oak trees. But then there's a problem when they lose power. The utilities up here now are not spiking trees. If they are oak trees, they're trying, and there's a percentage. They're trying to pass those and get back to them later in the season. But the burden falls on the utility company that if they don't complete the grid, they don't get paid. But they are doing that to save oak trees up here in the Midwest. But they're really on board, and there's a lot of good guys, and they're trying to do the best they can for the job that they got to do. So they are trying.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, it's a tough balance to try to maintain. So if you did need to trim an oak tree during more of a high pressure time, would treating before you prune help lower your risk and eliminate the threat of spreading the disease?
Yes, if you're in a high pressure area, if you're in a high pressure area, yes. But also I mentioned painting your pruning cuts. Essentially what happens is the beetle smells the fresh volatiles coming out of that wood. And so it attracts the beetles to the open cut or open wound. And so painting those cuts will seal it off. And that's what's cool as we're developing this liquid bark substance. That could be another thing for us there. But paint the cuts. In Texas, it's different than up north. We don't have the abundance of fungal mats. And so we also have just a huge number of oak trees. And so for the arborists that are in central Texas, that recommendation of not pruning it's a killer, you know? When over 50% of your canopy is oak, what are you supposed to do? You know, it's a hard thing. And then the other idea is that, you know, in the urban environment, we have squirrels that just chew the heck out of trees down here. And so how can you make this blanket statement of no pruning whenever you have all these other squirrels and hail, things like that, and they can damage trees? And so I have my thoughts about pruning during that time period. I think that in Texas, it is unlikely to spread it through pruning. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's just different down here. And usually within a couple of days of that open wound, you know, the process of compartmentalization has already started. And so within a few days, that tree's already formed a wall inhibiting any fungus from getting in there. So it's almost like it has to happen right away. There has to be a fungal mat close, and that beetle has to get to it right after that wound was formed. And so it's, to me, it's a low probability of it happening, at least in Texas.
Yeah, it's a lot higher in Michigan. Another point on pruning or injecting before you prune is you think about a compound moves through a 3-through transpirational pull. So if you prune first and then inject, you will never get any compound towards that pruning cut because there's nothing to pull it there. We recommend up here because we don't know where it's at. If you have to make a cut during the April to July, we do recommend a pruning sealer. There's a product that's kind of popular up here called Cut Guard that has an antibiotic also. But again, just try not to. Prevention is the best cure. Just do whatever you can to avoid touching an oak tree up here until the safe time of the year.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Emmett, when you were talking about the Tree IV and the F series, you mentioned something about real world PSI. Could you clarify what you meant by that?
So with the Tree IV, you can get up to 60 PSI. I think I saw that one pop up. It says, clarify, I don't remember saying real world PSI. We can use, basically with the tree IV, we're able to get up to 60 PSI. With the F series, it'll go up to 120 PSI, which I honestly think is too high. I like to use the F series around 80. But compared to macro infusion, which is operating around 20 PSI, we're able to move our materials in the tree a lot faster. So real world PSI with the tree IV, 50 to 60 is what it'll pump up to. If you are filling up that IV bottle to the max fill line with solution, you're probably going to have to pump up that bottle again. You're going to lose some pressure as that material starts to go into the tree.
Good points. Emmett, this one's definitely for you. Any movement on approval from Texas A&M on micro versus macro treatments? So
I mentioned earlier about Dr. Apple and what he's shared with me. I would say yes, but it's got to get published. And what I can say on that is, I think we've got lots of people all over the country that use our system for treating oak wilt. Talking to Jeff Palmer when he was still with the company, macro infusion for oak wilt's not even done in the north, hardly. Nobody does it that way. It's like they all use the tree IV. I think anecdotally that the thousands of oak trees that are treated with our system speaks more volume than a scientific study would. You know, if you have a scientific study that has 15 to 20 trees that are treated with the tree IV, that's great, but I've got hundreds of applicators that do thousands of trees every year with it, and they're not calling me up saying, hey, I treated a tree and it didn't work, or I treated all these hundreds of trees and it didn't work. And so I think the evidence is there that this is an effective treatment. And even that research study that I showed in my presentation, that's where their line of thought was going, was, hey, if we can do something to keep this concentration in the lower portion of the tree, it's going to do a better job. Because the whole idea behind the injections is to keep the fungus at bay, keep it from moving up the stem of the trunk, keep it from cutting off the vascular movement. So, long answer to a short question. We're working on it, Corey. Hopefully soon they will have some changes there.
We got time for a couple more. How wide deep should you trench? Leave the trench open, or what goes in it?
You don't have to trench very wide. The trench is just cutting the connected root systems. Depth, it depends on the soil. If your soil is shallow, then you don't have to trench as deep. If you have deep soils, you go as deep as you possibly can. In Texas, they're using a rock saw. I had a photo in there earlier of it. It's a very, I think they do like 4 feet, but in areas with deep soils, that's not even deep enough. The roots are much deeper than that are connected. So it's
recommendation up here is 5 foot. A lot of guys are getting a vibratory plow, but 5 foot up here.
Okay. Have either of you seen oak wilt progress faster in urban scenarios? So basically the tree's already got stresses from sidewalks and heat. Does that make the disease progress faster?
I would say it travels faster through root grafting on healthy trees.
I'm with Emmett on that one. I think there's not as, the root grafting is probably less opportunity in a planting bed in an urban landscape, street sidewalk, than it is in a natural setting.
Okay. I think we got one more question. Is there a risk of blowing bark off the tree at these higher pressures? Some people are only getting about the 30 PSI safely on ash, 40 PSI blowing bark off. That sounds like an arbor plug answer.
That's an interesting question. Generally, depending on the system you're using, correct. Especially in the springtime where your cells are differentiating, the cambium soft. Yeah, 20, 30 pounds can blow things off. I will say that with the arbor plug set properly, when we were developing these, I cranked equipment up to over 500 PSI, did not blow bark or damage any wood. I'm not saying that you can crank it up to that to do it, but it was under part of a destructive autopsy on trees. It's probably the depth of your injection needle more than it is the pressure. But it is soft in the spring. 20, 30 PSI can do it. On a tree IV with an arbor plug, we can hit 120 PSI with no bark separation whatsoever. So if you're using arbor plugs and you're still having that problem, you're probably not tapping them in deep enough. They may be straddling the cambium versus being set firmly in the xylem. If you're going plugless, you might have to get that stinger needle just a little bit deeper into the xylem.
Cool. I think there was just one follow-up question, and Emmett, Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but with the tree IV, it just maxes out at 60. You do not need to actually pressurize it to 60 for the device to function. And same with 120 and the F series, correct? It's just, that's its max, and you don't need to get it to 120 for the F series. Just as long as, you know, from everything I've done, as long as you get above 30 PSI on either system, that's enough pressure to at least get it moving.
I think you're right. I think they're set at that, and that's the blow off on them. That's only the max setting. It has nothing to do. The 120 on the new IV of the F series is for conifers primarily because you can help counterflow resin into your injection site. Very rarely 40 PSI. There's a recommendation in all the literature of what we recommend on deciduous trees, ring porous, diffuse porous, and tracheate vessel trees. But yeah, you don't need to go that high.
It's more of a there if you need it, not it has to be that pressure.
Correct.
Cool. All right. Well,
Yeah, Nathan, if you can, I saw your question pop up again. If you can see my screen still, if my PowerPoint slide is still up, make sure you're setting your plugs properly. Get them, they need to be recessed below the bark. It's a very common, that's the most common problem we run into is people do not set them properly. They will do them a little bit too shallow where they're just flush to the bark, kind of like this photo. And when that happens, you're pushing your material in between the bark and the xylem, and that results in some splitting of the wood and can cause some pretty nasty wounds. If your plug is set properly, that material is only going into the xylem vessels. The barbs on the plug block it from coming back around, and you will not have any issues with bark separation. So just make sure you're getting them set properly. Usually going to be about a 1/4 inch, maybe a little bit further below the surface of the bark.
so I think that covered all the questions related to this presentation. I did get a pretty good recommendation for another webinar, which Joe might affect you, Emmett, not so much, but about pine borers, covering pine borers.
Yeah. Oh man, we could get Dr. Don to do that.
We could.
He's
Yeah, I figured
expert.
between Dr. Don, JB, and Don Fluharty, that'd be a pretty good topic for those people to cover. And
just if you want to hear me and Joe again, we'll be back at it on Wednesday next week, 4 p.m. Eastern time, Emerald Ash Borer, and we're going to be really talking about Joe's experience with that pest since he's been in it since it started back in 2002. So I'm looking forward to that talk. It's going to be a good topic and some good conversation on it.
So I'm stopping the recording.